So, a huge Supreme Court decision just landed, and it's completely redrawing the map of America's trade wars. We're talking a massive constitutional showdown with consequences for, well, pretty much everyone. Let's get right into it and break down what just happened and what it really means.
And you know, our source material doesn't mince words. It puts it about as bluntly as you can. No careful, hedged legal language here. Just this.
So yeah, that's the big question, right? A president gets blocked, but the fight is so far from over. What does this ruling actually mean for trade, for politics, for the whole global economy? Let's figure it out.
Okay, first things first. We got to look at the core legal decision itself, because this really was a fundamental clash over who holds the power in the United States. So what the court essentially said was this. The law Trump was using, it's called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA for short. Well, that law was made for specific things, like freezing the assets of hostile governments or stopping terrorist money. It was not designed to let a president just rewrite the entire global trade system all by himself. And this right here, this really gets to the heart of the conflict. The president's argument was, hey, the trade deficit is a national emergency, so I can use this emergency power, the IEPA. But the court came back and said, nope, the Constitution is pretty clear. The power to regulate commerce with other countries, that belongs to Congress. It's right there in Article 1, Section 8.
And look, this wasn't some squeaker of a decision. It wasn't even close. We're talking a decisive 6-3 majority. That sends a really clear signal that the court believed the president had seriously overstepped his authority.
But here's what makes this whole thing truly fascinating. It's who was in that majority. Get this. All three of President Trump's own Supreme Court appointees, they all voted against him. So this wasn't some partisan fight, liberals versus conservatives. This was the court itself, including its most conservative members, basically drawing a big, bold, constitutional line in the sand.
Okay, so the court slams one door shut. Boom. But Trump's response? It was immediate, and it shows you just how far this fight is from being over.
I mean, just look at this timeline. The speed here is really the whole story. At 10 a.m., the Supreme Court hands down its ruling. By 2 p.m., that's just 4 hours later, Trump is already out there announcing a new 10% global tariff, but this time he's using a totally different law. He basically found another door and just walked right on through.
Now, the key thing to understand is that this new tool he's using, the Trade Act of 1974, it's not a blank check like the other one. It's got rules. It requires investigations, consultations, the whole shebang. So while it's definitely more constrained than the emergency powers the court just shot down, Trump is clearly betting that it's still enough to keep his whole tariff strategy going.
So with this legal earthquake shaking things up, how did the rest of the world react? Well, at first glance, it actually looked like good news. But, as you'll see, the reality is way more complicated.
So the market's initial reaction was pretty positive. You can see it right here. Stocks rallied. I think investors looked at the ruling and thought, okay, great, one big layer of uncertainty is gone. The threat of these unlimited, out-of-the-blue tariffs under emergency powers, that was officially off the table.
But that optimism might have been a little premature, because as our source material argues, this ruling didn't actually end the trade war. It just moved the battlefield. In fact, it might have actually injected more long-term uncertainty into the system.
And this is a perfect example of why. So think about it. You've got countries like India or Indonesia who recently signed these big trade deals, and they signed them with the very real threat of those now illegal tariffs hanging over their heads. Well, now that the Supreme Court says that threat was illegal, those countries can turn around and argue the whole deal was coerced, that it was signed under duress, and that it should be void. Suddenly, the entire legal foundation of Trump's negotiating pressure just, poof, collapses. Of course, a legal fight this big instantly becomes a political one. And this one struck right at the core of the administration's public image.
I mean, think about it. Trump's entire political brand is built on this idea of the strong leader who just gets things done, right? The guy who wins, who makes the best deals, who isn't afraid to smash through the old rules. Well, this ruling is a direct punch to that whole narrative.
Losing at the Supreme Court, that puts a pretty big crack in that winner image. It's a powerful reminder that, hey, even the president isn't above the law. But what's maybe even more important is that it gives political opponents, and that includes Republicans who were maybe a little nervous to speak out before, it gives them what our source calls constitutional cover to start criticizing this overreach.
All right, so let's pull all these threads together. What does this new landscape actually look like? Where does global trade policy even go from here?
Well, this is the new reality we're all living in. The tariff war, it's not over, not by a long shot. It's just become a fight for lawyers. Those old trade deals we talked about, they're now on shaky ground. And what about the retaliatory tariffs that other countries, like in the EU, put on American goods? Yep, they're still there. So if you're a business trying to make a plan, well, the only thing you can be certain about is uncertainty.
And you know, this all leads to maybe the biggest question of all. For decades, Congress has been more than happy to just hand off tough trade decisions to the president, let them deal with it. But now the court is saying, whoa, there are limits to that. So, if the president's hands are tied and Congress is too gridlocked to actually pass any laws, who's in charge? We could be looking at total policy paralysis.
So the game just keeps on going. The battlefield has shifted. It's not about pure economics anymore, it's about constitutional law. But the fight? Oh, it is far from over. This one ruling has basically kicked off a whole new season of legal and political battles that are going to define trade policy for years.
And really, that's the perfect way to think about this moment. What the Supreme Court did, it wasn't the end of the story. It was just the end of the beginning. It was the end of the first chapter. And what comes next? Well, that all depends on a whole new series of legal fights and political battles that, right now, nobody can predict.